So if you're watching the news and you type in Malcolm Gladwell trans, you will have noticed that there is a furore that has exploded over the podcast that we did with Malcolm that was released this week. And it has to do with the comments he made around trans athletes, and particularly around a conference that both he was at as a moderator and Professor Rostucker, my co-host, who's with me now, where they were debating this issue. And this issue has come to light in the fact that many of these outlets and news outlets, Yahoo News, Newsweek, the New York Post, all sorts of social media platforms have retweeted and commented on his comments in our podcast, and said that he's basically changed his mind. He's changed his views and how, this is what he thinks now, trans athletes. But I think it was important for us as the hosts of the podcast to maybe put into context exactly what happened. First of all, at the conference where the incident took place, and second of all, his comments when he was talking to us on the podcast this week. So, Ross, I mean, we were quite surprised. This is a classic example of social media and how it works in the world right now, where a 30-second clip can go completely viral and people start talking about it, and it's contextualized slightly differently. And some people do a good job in terms of how they explain it. Some people do a terrible job about it. Some people get the spelling of your name wrong in the context of it. But the reality is that this is now blown up, and a 30-second segment in a 2-hour podcast has now become the story of this podcast. Can you give us an idea of what you felt like when you saw this clip in particular kind of get the coverage that it has in the last 48 hours?
Like the short answer, and there's lots of context, so bear with me, but it actually pisses me off a little bit, because that was a 100-minute long interview with him that I thought produced so many good insights and valuable comments, many of which I thought would be equally interesting to people, like band parents, strip dopers of everything they've done in the sport when they get caught, how he got 10,000-hour explanations wrong, the stuff about relative age, thoughts on track and field. I thought there was so much. It was such a rich interview. And it's quite frustrating when 100 minutes gets distilled and only really 1 minute of it is discussed. But that's the nature of the beast, right? And the thing about it is, and this is the context, is like I 100% understand why it happens, because that's the issue that so many people are passionate about. And I think that especially women are right to be passionate about it. It's well within they're the ones directly affected by it. And you can't tell people what should matter to them. And it matters to them, and it matters to me. But I wish that we didn't live in a world where that would become such a talking point. I said before, like, I don't want to spend my sports science energies explaining why males don't belong in women's sport. It feels ridiculous to me.
Mm.
And I know this is true for everyone in this debate, right? And you don't want to talk about it as a journalist. Helen Joyce,
Yeah.
Helen Joyce, like we've said her on the podcast, she doesn't want to spend her time in court cases defending and helping women who've lost their jobs because they spoke out about something like this. There are countless people in the world who would far rather be spending their time, their energies, and their expertise on other things. And I think this is an example of that. But it was, at the time he said it, a provocative statement, an admission of shame, and the contrition he showed. Like, it was obviously going to go big, I thought.
Mm.
But yeah, then I didn't, the scale of it maybe not as large as I expected. I didn't know it would go quite as large and as hostile as it's gone from both sides, which is
Yes,
another.
because there's a couple of issues. One of them, as you mentioned there, is that a lot of female and the female sporting community saying, why didn't he speak up about this more strongly before? And they felt let down by him and called him misogynist and all sorts of things. And the second part is that there's obviously a shift in the way that people think about this issue around transport. And I think that's where things have become, those are the two parties that feel to me the most affected by the comments and the debate.
Yeah, and everything I'm about to say now is prefaced by the fact that it's relatively safe and possible for us to talk about this as dispassionate observers because we're not directly affected by it, right? Women who've spoken about this issue for the last 6 or 7 years have faced far more vitriol and attacks and criticisms than I have, and that we will face even now. But it's an interesting dilemma because when you're involved in this argument, this fight, as it were, to protect women's sports, if we narrow the context, it's good to have allies who are influential, respected thinkers. So the notion, I think, of anyone coming along and saying we support you, that's what women needed 5 or 6 years ago. When it arrives now and they are angry about it, you can understand why. I mean, some of the comments that I got on social media from people are things like, I'm sorry, I just can't bring myself to be gracious and accept his support because I lost my job as a consequence of speaking out because I wasn't cowed.
Mm.
Gladwell was, in his own words, remember he said, I was cowed and therefore I didn't stand up for certain things that I knew to be true. There are lots of people who have stood up and have lost a great deal or
Yeah.
faced a great deal of abuse, and they are understandably angry about that, I think. But at the same time, I do hope that people will recognize that. And I've certainly tried not ever to judge a person for changing their mind.
Mm.
To me, it's a sign of progress.
Mm.
And so if I'm glass half full, I would rather be saying, actually, this is a good thing now that people have recognized a, a change in the broader context of the debate, but also maybe having spent a little bit more time on it themselves, thought about it, recognized the problem, the scale of that issue. Now they're willing to come out and say something that 3 or 4 years ago they were too cowed to say. I would rather celebrate that as progress, but that's easy for me to say, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's just, for those of the listeners right now who want to understand where this all happened, it was at the Sports Analytics Conference in 2022. Is that right?
Yeah, in March in Boston, it's
Yeah.
it's a pretty big annual event that they have there.
Yeah. So in this debate was around, the title was called Transgender Athletes, a conversation led by Malcolm Gladwell on data and participation policy. The people involved was Katie Barnes. So let's just explain who these people were. Katie Barnes was who?
Katie Barnes is a journalist who worked among us and potentially still does with ESPN and writes a great deal of articles advocating in support of inclusion policies. And when we talk about inclusion, we're talking about transgender inclusion. Barnes was also pretty vocal on the DSD cases, the likes of Caster Semenya. I remember first interacting with Barnes back in 2018, 19 in the lead up to the Semenya case and subsequently. So when I was invited on that panel, obviously the first thing you say is, I wonder who else is on it. And okay, Barnes is on. So, okay, there's one person I'm going to be debating directly against.
Even though she's a journalist, or is she's a contributor to ESPN, but is she writing as a journalist or as a advocate or representative of that community?
My interpretation was definitely the latter.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, you
So
know how it
she's
is. Like if you've edited and you'll get a piece, and there's a message that that journalist has tried to put into that piece, and they've
mm,
interviewed the people who tell that story. I didn't see Barnes as a neutral observer of the issue. And in the
yeah.
debate, you've watched it, you'd see the position she
Yeah.
occupied. That's what Barnes was writing about.
Yeah. And then Joanna Harper, tell us who she was. She was the other, along with you and Malcolm, that she was the other panelist.
Yeah, so Jana Harper, those who followed the sports participation transgender debate would know the name because Harper was the first person to go to sport and say, I have a solution for you. So Harper is a transgender woman, so biological male, who personally motivated, I suppose, obviously, but also as a scientist, saw that the sports authorities, IOC, was grappling with this issue around transgender inclusion. Like, how do we include transgender women, males into women's sport? Because I don't think anyone in their right minds, and there are some people out there who are not in their right minds, but most people who are wouldn't say, oh, there's no such thing as male advantage. Except,
Mm,
except maybe the IOC as we're sitting here talking about this, which is crazy to me. But most people recognize that we can't just let people identify into sports. So what are we going to do? And I think there was a lot of pressure on the IOC. And Harper came along and said, I have exactly what you need. Here is a study I've done on runners who have suppressed testosterone. And look, lowering testosterone removes the performance advantage. And that's how Harper became prominent in the debate, because Harper was the first person to do this research that gave, in effect, the floundering, drowning IOC a life jacket. And they clung to that thing because they said, hallelujah, we've got a solution now. All we have to do is put a policy in place that lowers the testosterone, and we can have both. We can have inclusion and fairness. And that was 20 years ago almost. In that time, it's become, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, increasingly obvious that that life jacket is in fact a concrete block because it just doesn't work. You can't take the male advantage away. And so it was a poorly done study with very little in the way of scientific control. There was no control group. There was no monitoring and adherence. It was self-reported times. It was just not a very strong study, but it became fundamental. It was the fulcrum on which the whole IOC policy and therefore all other sports based their policies. So then, okay, so that was a decade or two back. Harper continued to be an advocate in the space for trans inclusion and the notion of testosterone suppression. By 2022, and this is the important context, it had become clear that testosterone suppression didn't work. It was the emperor's clothes. And many sports, World Rugby in 2020, World Athletics, swimming actually immediately after World Rugby, cycling, I think, had just come around as well. They said that they would no longer be using testosterone suppression because it didn't remove male advantage. And the reason I highlight that is that in that conference, we saw the first shifts away from equal performance if trans women, males compete against women, to this idea of meaningful competition and meaningful, non-significant advantages. And that was the context of her appearance there.
Yeah, I mean, in that debate, she does admit that when this testosterone suppression actually happens, hemoglobin goes down to female levels. Various other markers do, but there is still that male advantage in terms of muscle mass, even though it's reduced. It's still not where women's is. There's also height and skeletal benefits that they've had. So she kind of does admit to that to some extent as part of her research.
And as I say, that was the shift, because when World Rugby put together that panel in 2020, that was just before lockdown. So what are we talking? February 2020. The conversation was very much does male advantage persist with testosterone reduction? And there were two camps. The scientific one, not with the benefit of hindsight, but at the time, no, testosterone. And you've touched on them as well. Like you're not going to change the skeleton and the height and the limb length and the proportions. That's never going to be affected. 0% change. And then there are other systems, muscle strength and power and muscle mass, body fat, where you might see some change, but it's only part of the initial male-female difference. And then, yes, there were one or two physiological attributes like hemoglobin, where the changes after testosterone suppression were larger. But the net result was, and a paper came out by Emma Hilton and Tommy Lindbergh summarizing the literature, and then Harper also produced a review. And those papers pretty much agreed with one another that many male advantages in sport persisted beyond the suppression of testosterone. So Harper couldn't come to Boston with that same argument anymore. It would have been like a straight up dishonest argument. But what had happened was the argument evolved to say testosterone suppression can reduce the advantage enough that performance can be meaningfully compared between males and females. So the notion of meaningful competition was born. And there were these, and it's absurd. It's like saying that if I used a motor in my bicycle to lose to Tadej Pogačar by only 30 seconds, that's fair. It's not fair because how I achieved it is the problem, not the size of the difference.
Yeah.
They were making arguments like that Michael Phelps and Katie Ledecky were winning races by 2%. And that wasn't meaningful because it was but of course it was meaningful because it was fair. So we started to get into philosophical territory, and I think Harper's card in Boston was that.
So in the context of all that, what did you see Malcolm's role in? He was there as the mediator. So for you as a panel member, what did you think his role was in that time?
So you told me you've watched it.
I've watched most of it. I haven't watched all of it yet because it is an hour long. And we will put the link, by the way, in the show notes, so you can watch it yourself as you're listening to this. You can watch the whole thing.
I ask because I promise you will have better insights than I have because I don't remember much of it. It passed
Mm.
me by in a blur because it was a very frustrating experience because Harper and Barnes were playing like one card and I was trying to present data. And we'll get to this in a moment, I guess. But the
Mm.
way this debate works is that the sides don't address one another. I'm coming with theory and evidence and biological statistics and concepts, and they play the emotive card, you know, human sloganeering, trans rights are human rights, trans woman are woman, hashtag. So I don't remember much after the fact, but before the fact, before the time, to answer your question, the expectation is, because you know it's Malcolm Gladwell, that he's going to come and do something really creative to try and force us to think outside of our normal way of thinking in order to uncover some creative solution to the problem. That's what I expected he would do. But you also expect the moderator in a debate to come in and be neutral, which I think is an important point. You've done it. You would have
Yeah,
moderated discussions and debates. And you know that if that debate ends and people say he didn't give enough time to one side compared to the other, then you've done a bad job. So your whole purpose is to go in there and facilitate and almost be anonymous. I
correct.
think.
Yes, that makes total sense. And do you felt with during the actual debate, and as you say, you don't remember that clearly. In the stuff that I've seen, he does that pretty well. He asks all the right questions. He gives everybody an equal chance to talk as things get more heated.
How
Um,
did he start? You saw the start. Did he started off with quite a creative approach to it?
yes, he talked about the Martians. So he said, "How would we present this to a Martian who came down to Earth and said, well, why have you got this delineation between men and women? How would you
Yeah.
explain it to a Martian?" So that was the premise of the start of the conversation, which is classic Malcolm Gladwell, trying to
Yeah,
help
that's what
people
I thought at the
understand it.
time. And I was
Mm,
just totally expecting something like that. And that's what he did. He said, let's distill this to the simplest possible way and explain it to someone from outer space. And I
mm,
think I answered first. And it was a good one because it tees up really well. Males are different from females. The differences are X, Y, Z, depending whether it's strength, power, endurance, and so on. Why do those differences exist? And thus we have a men's champion and a women's champion at Wimbledon. We have a gold medalist in the men's category and it's the same as weight categories in boxing. You can say so. So I don't know if I said that. I should have. It would have been, but anyway, it was a
mm.
good start, I thought.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, and I think for everybody, when I saw all the reaction to the podcast and particularly that clip, I went to look and to say, when people were saying he's changed his mind about this based on the fact that he's seemingly apologizing for the way he handled um, the actual debate, I guess the first question is, do you feel that he needs to apologize for the way he handled that debate? Because on the basis of what we've said now as a moderator, he's not there to defend you or the other side. He's there to create and get both sides of the opinion. So does he need to apologize, do you think?
I remember feeling at the time like frustrated at the way the debate went.
Mm,
Um, and it's human nature to never say it was my fault. So who was I going to blame? And I don't like I didn't blame him, but I remember thinking you go you play it over in your mind, you know, play by play. You say if he'd asked me something else at that moment, instead of letting Barnes and Harper take it off in a direction of let us win, I would have been able to say something more profound and powerful, and it would have gone differently. So I remember thinking with a degree of frustration that it would have been good to drag it back to my home ground, which was the
mm,
biological data, because there was a point in that debate where we lost that. And I ended up playing, as it were, away from home because it was all about the persecution, the fact that there's meaningful competition, the fact that there were so few. These are the points that Harp and Barnes would have been making. So few
mm,
athletes. It's so minimally disruptive to women that they should just accept it for the greater good of society. Those were the kinds of emotive arguments that were being made. And I'm not
mm,
there to play that game. I want to talk about the biological facts and what it'll cause and the talent pathways. And I didn't get that opportunity. But I don't think
mm,
that's anyone's fault. And in hindsight, I could have dragged it back there myself. Why
mm.
let someone else? do it. So no, I didn't think he needed to apologize and be ashamed of it, but I understand why he would have been.
There seems to be no evidence to suggest that he is pro or he was pro trans athletes participating in women's sport. And therefore, he's not changing his mind all of a sudden. He's just regretful of the way that that particular occurrence happened at that debate. That's the kind of the way I see it. I mean, has he changed his mind on this? Doesn't seem to be like that.
I think a little bit, but it's not like I've flopped from or flipped from position X to position Y or A to Z or Z if you want to be American. um, he was, for instance, on an interview with Megyn Kelly on her podcast back in 2022 in September. So that puts it 6 months after that Sloan debate session. And they discussed very briefly, admittedly, the issue. And in that interview, he spoke a little bit about the fact that there were so few cases and that the Leah Thomas, for instance, was getting disproportionate attention given that it was really one case. Now, we know that it wasn't one case. There were many examples of it, but even if it was only one case, you can make the case that that one case affects so many other athletes because it's podium places, it's golds, it's records, it's spots on teams, it's lanes in finals, it's scholarships. So there's always a cascade. Every one unfair athlete, you don't make the case to say there's only one doper in the Olympic 800-meter final, so it's not a problem. You say it's a problem.
Mm.
So
Mm.
so at that point, at least publicly, he was still adopting an argument that was kind of in defense based on numbers and scale, given the broader context of the societal debate, um, which I think has largely been refuted. And the bit he said to us was that the societal wind direction has changed, and so therefore
Mm.
that those perceptions will evolve. So I don't think it was an entirely 180-degree flip, but I think this is the root of the issue actually is so many people in this debate, it's not the fight they've chosen. And so when they discuss it as distant participants in it. And they're not invested enough to really interrogate some of the thoughts that they might have. And you get a superficial discussion. And
Mm.
superficial discussions, I think, are characterized by that kind of opinion. And I'm saying that as my own mea culpa because back in like 2016, 17, I remember being asked about the issue, like offhandedly. So what do you think? And I knew that the IOC had a policy to suppress testosterone levels, and I hadn't really engaged with it. I hadn't sat down and looked at the evidence. And I remember saying, if you take the testosterone away, the male advantage will disappear. So I think it's fine. So my first contribution to this debate was in support of the IOC policy. And it was only in the preparation for the Caster Semenya trial in 2019, reading more and researching a little bit more, did you realize actually that that's like Swiss cheese theory. It's full of holes. And then your position evolves. So people could criticize me for changing my mind too, and I hope that they'll be gracious enough to understand that it's not that I changed my mind. It's just that I wasn't immersed, and then I was, and then I saw. And so in a sense, I think that's more like what happens with cases like Malcolm Gladwell is remember he spoke to us about most people are experience rich and theory poor.
Yeah.
What happens if you're experience poor and theory poor? You don't know but you're being asked because you're an influential thinker. You should have an opinion. Like I was asked because, hey, sports scientist, ask this guy. But I had no theory and I had no experience. I shouldn't have said anything, but I did. And then I looked like I changed my mind once I accumulated experience and theory. And I think that's
Mm.
more like what's happened here.
Mm. Because we look back on this now and we think, well, it's as he says in the podcast, how things have changed, and if you had to do that conference now, the sentiment would be different. That's what he suspects. It would be interesting to know if that is true. But hindsight is a perfect science. So as you've suggested, you've also learned through this process. You initially were supportive. You did the research. You also, at the end of the day, is a journalist, and his job is to learn how things develop. So in other words, he's going to change his mind based on new evidence, which is exactly what he has done without necessarily being, they're almost holding him to the standard that he is somebody that is influencing policy, when in fact he's just a thinker that is a cultural influence. And do people make decisions based on what Malcolm Gladwell says? I don't know whether they do. As much as we respect him as a thinker and a writer and an author and a podcaster, he's not there to define
Mm.
policy. And therefore, is it even worth saying he's changed his mind on something? Because what difference does it make if he is? That's kind of what I think.
Well, I think the anger that many women have expressed in the last 24, 48 hours at his change tells you that it mattered to them.
Yeah.
Um, like it's a hell of a lonely place when you're the only person arguing against what is societally accepted in one direction, and you're standing there going, I almost have this vision in my mind. Remember that famous photo of the guy in Beijing standing in front of tanks in Tiananmen Square?
Yeah.
Like ideologically, this debate feels like that a lot of the time because you're
Mm.
standing there and you're about to get crushed. And like people like Helen and Emma and all that, I've met so many like interesting people in the last while in this debate. They've stood there in front of the not physical tanks, but the people have lost jobs, like we said, And I think if influential thinkers had formed opinions in support of women earlier, the situation wouldn't have evolved to the detriment of so many people. I genuinely think that. Like, I think if I'd, again, I can't speak for other people, but like if I'd had an opinion earlier, would it, and maybe we overvalue an influence to some degree, but I think that more, especially men, should have stood up vocally in support,
Do you
because
think that it's well that is one area that I think is debatable. I almost think it is women and the women's sporting community that haven't stood up enough because it is the direct threat to them. It's more important for the women's sporting community to speak up about this than
yeah,
the men's one. Um,
it's
so it's
necessary that they do, but it's less safe for them to do it, you know?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and that's the thing, like if this is the paradox as well. If we understand why someone like Malcolm Gladwell would be cowed, and I think I do, I understand why people would be cowed, because whether you're scared of emotional blowback, whether you overvalue the opinion of others, and I think Malcolm Gladwell's got quite a thick skin. I don't think he really cares. Whether you're worried about the financial implications, job security, how it's going to affect your family and your loved ones, whatever it is, you may have your own reasons to be nervous and have some trepidation about offering your viewpoint. And I don't want to stand in judgment of why someone wants to hold on to their opinion. But there are a lot of people who have said in the last 5 or 6 years is I wish I'd come forward sooner, but I was just scared. And like I totally get that.
Mm,
But men, I think men had less to lose than women did.
mm.
And so the people who really could have and should have, I think, come forward sooner were those. And I think that's why people are angry. So I do think it makes an impact. Like if again, how's this if you apply a Gladwell approach, if a Martian came to Earth today and said, who are the influential thinkers that shape the way society thinks, he'd be on that list. And so therefore, his opinion must matter.
Yeah,
But, sorry, the paradox that I was referring to earlier is that if it's acceptable and understandable why someone would be cowed, then when they admit that and come forward, you've got to say, actually, that was courageous, no matter when you did it. And
yeah.
so
And I
now you're
think
on our side, and now we are glad to have you in support of us. But fine, like they're still angry that it didn't come sooner.
and you've said it on your Twitter feed that in fact his ability to admit to this and to talk about his failings or his perception of failings is admirable in itself because we are entitled to change our views and our way that we've done things, and not many people do. So I agree, he should be celebrated for that.
And so many people in their responses, not just to mine, but to other people who've been discussing, have said, I can never trust him again because look how he changes his mind.
Yeah.
People, a person who changes their mind is more trustworthy than someone who doesn't.
Mm.
We've got that thing completely upside down.
Yeah.
We should be encouraging people to be intellectually agile enough to change their mind in the face of new information and new experiences, new theory, new experiences. But the number of people who said, "Oh, he's dead to me now because he's changed," it's like, guys, come
Mm.
on, this is good.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then for you personally, as my final question, if you would you agree with him that you think the sentiment since 2022 has changed to the point where if you had to do this debate again with the same people, that the reaction would be different? How do you perceive it? Because you've got messages on social media, you've had all sorts of weird threats, and people are going to report you to your boss, etc., etc. But do you perceive that there is a shift in the way this is happening now, and that the debate is slightly healthier and less emotional?
Yeah, it is. Like, it's safer now to express fact. And so, and by the way, I said earlier, like, people were distant observers and they weren't really involved in the arena, and so they didn't have with hindsight now, like, I mean, how involved did you really need to be to say no males in women's sport? It's a funny, you get cornered by that because you're like, did you really need all that evidence to say that males shouldn't be in women's sport? Because you don't understand what it was like at the time in 2016, 17, and so on. So the context changes, and the need for the evidence you mentioned does. But I think in hindsight, yeah, actually, why did I need all that evidence? But I think what's happened is the the people have seen so many more of these examples. And Malcolm said this on our podcast. He said, in every state in the US, there are now sports events, scholarships, titles, records that have been broken by males competing in women's sports. There have been at least a handful of court cases around the world, most recently in the UK around snooker or pool, I think it was, where in that instance, the woman won the case against male inclusion. So that's progress. The big 5 or 6 sports in the Olympics have now all changed their policy. None of that existed in 2020. So with rugby, the first one, and then you had the athletics, cycling, and track, which are the 3 big Olympic sports. A whole bunch of others have followed suit. The tide has definitely changed. And when you look at survey results, you see that even as divided as the United States is between the red and the blue, the Republicans and the Democrats, it's an issue on which actually on both sides the majority agree that trans women shouldn't be in women's sports. So that in a sense has enabled people to come out from shelter into the open and say, I agree. So like we wrote those papers, the critique of the IOC paper, and then the sex screening paper in 2024. In 2020, there were 3 scientists in the world who had put their name to that. By 2024, there are 30. Now, there's still like 10 on the other side, and the fight won't be over until it's none on the other side.
Mm.
So like there's still
Yeah.
work to be done. Like the Algerian boxer Khalif has announced they're going to go to the Court of Arbitration to challenge World Boxing's policy and the genetics screening procedure that's being instituted. So that'll be the next fight.
Mm.
But if like one battle at a time, like I think it's changing, and people who previously, for reasons that I personally absolutely understand, were too nervous to come forward, they're now throwing their proverbial hats in the ring. It's definitely changing.
Yeah. Well, if you want to listen to that podcast, it's not only available on all your podcast players, wherever you listen to your podcast, but also on our YouTube channel, where you can watch the actual interview and you can see our faces, and Malcolm's face for that matter. Don't forget you can support us and be part of the discussion on Discourse. There is a huge debate going on our Discourse channel at the moment about this and all the reaction to this podcast. So listen up, and you can get some context. And I hope that you listen to this particular podcast with a little bit more clarity as to the background of Malcolm's comment. But for now, it's goodbye.
You have been listening to the Science of Sport podcast